Now in this section, I'm going to get into the mind and kind of go over some things you need to know. Now this is not going to be a primer on every aspect of the brain. This is, about teaching you how we respond, but also understand that there are actual things that go on in our brain, and that you need to understand on a basic level how your brain works if you'll be able to teach people to overcome fear. So, again, before we get into any discussion, we need to have an appreciation for how our brains work. Again, this is a very neglected aspect in our view of warrior development. And a lot of people pay a lot of lip service to it, but they never really delve into it. And also, because they don't delve into it and understand how the mind works, they don't have the ability to help people overcome fear. So, your brain on fear and danger. Again, and fear is not just an emotional state, but a real physiological phenomenon that starts in a part of the brain called the amygdala. And that part of the brain triggers all kinds of responses in the brain. So this is the part of the brain, or it's a defense mechanism that protects us, in times of, danger, moderate stress, high danger, whatever the case may be. But also it triggers arousal in the body and heightens our awareness. And this is key. And I'll get into that in a little more detail. So it's our body's way of telling us to pay attention to something, or either to move or be prepared to move. And no matter what we do, we don't really have much of a choice in whether we sense fear and danger if we're paying attention, but we have a choice in how we respond. So in other words, this is a physiological response to our observation or our perception of what we perceive to be dangerous or something to be dangerous. However, once we understand that, we do have a choice in how we respond, and I'll get into that a little later on. So the amygdala, fear, again, is found deep within the brain and temporal lobe. And really, you have two amygdala, or amygdalae, as some people refer to it. But it plays a major role, not only in our ability to sense danger or fear, or, raises our level of, awareness, but also a major role in emotional and behavioral and memory. And a part of the reason why a lot of people hold on to phobias is because they had a bad experience as a child, or whatever the case may be. And through that fear response and their amygdala remembering that, eventually it gets encoded into their brain to the subconscious competence level. And so they always have a fear of it. I mean, we've all known people who had a fear of spiders or whatever the case may be. I had a friend, he actually had a fear of ducks and swans. And the reason was he was attacked when he was a little kid around the lakes. I have a friend, he has a fear of being in enclosed spaces, and claustrophobia is a very common phobia. But his situation was because of the fact that he was actually kidnapped one time and thrown in the trunk of a car. Thought that these people who kidnapped him were going to take him somewhere and shoot him and kill him. So, that's an understandable fear. But, that arousal of the amygdala and that memory is burned into, the fiber of his being. So it's very difficult for him to get over that. But keep in mind, too, when we're talking about this arousal, we're also talking about a response in the brain, or what people call the fight-flight response or freeze response. And I'll explain that in the next slide. So, again, when we're exposed to fear, signals are sent, and it heightens awareness. And the signals go to the motor cortex and then tells us whether we're going to fight or whether we're going to run or freeze. So I know people have been taught about the fight-flight response or fight or flight response, but the truth of the matter is it's not actually fight or flight, it's fight-flight. And what I mean by that is the same part of the brain that processes whether we should run in the motor cortex is the same part that tells us whether we should fight. So in other words, because it's fight-flight, we have a choice depending on the perception of how we view the situation. So when we're talking about our physiological responses to fear, I'm just going to go through this briefly, but there's an increase in blood flow to the muscles, increase in blood pressure, heart rate, constriction of blood vessels in many parts of the body, paling or flushing, inhibition of the stomach, that queasy feeling kind of we get in the gut, dilation of the pupils, auditory exclusion, or what people kind of call hearing loss or auditory exclusion, and tunnel vision or loss of peripheral vision, shaking, these things of that nature. But you got to understand that, acknowledging fear doesn't make you a coward. And this is important to understand. Doesn't make you a coward. It just makes you human. And that it is rather the norm than the exception. And so if in situations where you're sensing danger, if you're not at least aware, or your awareness is not raised, this is not a good thing, because that means you're not paying attention. And if you cannot recognize danger, you're stupid. It's just that simple. Because without the ability to recognize danger, you'll literally kill yourself or get killed over something that would normally be something you could avoid. When we're talking about Miyamoto Musashi, arguably one of the greatest swordsmen ever lived, but he had some great, profound things about fear. And he talks about things like confidence and standing in that space. But confidence is the ability to stand in that space between fear and courage. That's really what it is. And courage is the ability to function in fear's presence and doing what must be done. And this is where you get the quote from attributed to Plato, where he talks about how all of Greece knows what the right thing is to do, but only the Spartans want to do anything about it. So what we're talking about is, when we're talking about that fight-flight response, we're talking about a perception. And Hannibal talks about how perception is a tool pointed at both ends. And what Hannibal means by that is that depending on how you perceive a situation or perceive something is going to determine the decision that you make. And so, because the fight-flight response is processed in the same place, through training, you can actually train yourself to make certain decisions. But you got to know, first of all, that you have control over that to some degree, and there are ways you can train yourself to become desensitized, and where you learn how to push out those things that are not critical to understand or know in that moment, so you can focus on the things you need to focus on. But understand that the fight-flight response or freeze response is just a response that tells our body either to move, or in some situations, depending on, again, the context and the circumstances, to not move at all. In the next section, I'm going to kind of get into this and give you an example of what I'm talking about as far as how we go through this process of making decisions.